Good morning, everyone, and I am delighted. My name is Sheila Smith, and I'm the Council on Foreign Relations here in Washington, D.C. I want to thank the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for putting on such a tremendous event today. If you had to imagine the who's who of the U.S.-Japan security relationship, you couldn't have imagined a more rich panel of speakers and discussants. I also want to congratulate Admiral Blair. We are looking forward to your leadership of the conversation on the strategic ambitions and purpose of the U.S.-Japan alliance. So let me get to our panel. We are fortunate to have with us today two of the Obama administration's key thinkers and implementers of our policy towards Asia. The strategic focus of the United States in Asia has undergone a transition. We refer to it as the rebalance. Some people like to still use the word pivot. But in fact, this is a longer-term effort to refocus American attention, not just government attention, but broad American attention on our long-term interests in the Asia-Pacific. I think the idea that American strategy, however, can be implemented without thinking about the backdrop of events and changes in the region, of course, is not possible. We've had an awful lot of events in the Asia-Pacific. It is not a static place these days. Just in Northeast Asia from 2009, we had a transition in government in Japan, right? In 2010, we had provocations and the loss of life on the Korean Peninsula. We had, of course, the terrible triple disasters in Japan and Operation Tomodachi as a response. And in 2012, we had the eruption of the most intense Japan-China tensions in the post-war period. So Asia is not a static place, and the two gentlemen that we have here to discuss our policy towards the region have had to manage and cope through a very difficult time, not only for the region, but also for U.S. policy. I have, on my immediate left, is our Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, the Honorable Daniel Russell. He is a career Foreign Service officer. Before going to the State Department, he was the President's Senior Director for Asian Affairs. He has served in the Asia-Pacific as well as other posts and is one of our most experienced diplomats. To his left is Mark Lippert. Mark is the Chief of Staff for the Secretary of Defense. He is the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs in the Department of Defense. Mark Lippert was a former Navy SEAL. He served on the Capitol Hill in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he was very early on one of the President's foreign policy advisors. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the podium over first to Assistant Secretary Russell to help us understand what happened on the President's trip, but also the broader role of our Asia policy. Danny, welcome. Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. Congratulations, Admiral Blair. Thanks to the Sasakawa Group. I'm happy to be here, particularly with my friend and colleague, Mark Lippert. You've got some great speakers in the lineup today. I see a lot of friendly and familiar faces here. So I know there's a lot of experience and expertise in the room. I think what would be most useful for me would be to offer some context on our overall Asia-Pacific strategy as it relates to the U.S.-Japan security partnership, but go a little bit beyond the partnership per se. Without belaboring the point, our strategy towards the Asia-Pacific region, or the rebalance strategy, is predicated on the simple proposition that the region is hugely consequential to U.S. National security and economic interests. And in that context, we've known all along that Japan plays a very important role. Economically, in the next 5 years, nearly half of the global economic growth outside the United States is expected to come from the Asia-Pacific region, and it's really a given that this region is tremendously important for U.S. jobs, as well as for U.S. economic growth, as well as for U.S. security. So I know from experience, as does Mark, that it was very much with our national security interests and our economic future in mind that in the beginning of 2009, the President and the policymakers in the government looked at how our resources as a nation were distributed and concluded that we needed balance them, to rebalance them. And so over the course of that 5.5 years, we've worked to do that, to achieve a better allocation of time and attention of our top officials, better allocation of our diplomatic resources, our trade policies, development efforts, and our military posture as well. But throughout, the emphasis has been on beginning with our alliances and working with our allies in close security partnerships, and we've put a tremendous amount of energy into strengthening the relationships with allies, Australia, Republic of Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, and importantly, Japan, which is the subject of the discussions today. But we've also upgraded our economic engagement and our trade relationships with these partners, everything from the Chorus FTA with Seoul, the ongoing negotiations on TPP with Japan, Australia, and others. We've invested in diplomatic and people-to-people ties. We've strengthened, of course, a range of security cooperation, which both Mark and I will talk a little bit more about, partly to deal with the threat from North Korea. We also deployed Marines to Darwin. We've just signed an access agreement with the Philippines. We cooperate with Australia and Japan in a trilateral context. There's a lot of good work going on. And beyond the government-to-government cooperation, we've also invested heavily in people-to-people ties and connections. And the net result, I think, of all of these efforts is an astonishingly high level of public support for the relationships and for the alliances in each of the 5 allied countries. Polling shows in Australia something on the order of 89% support for the alliance. Recently, 95% of South Koreans agree that maintaining close relations with the U.S. is important for security. The numbers in the Philippines are in the 90s, in Thailand in the 90s. In Japan, 85% favor maintaining the security alliance with the U.S. And that last number is important, not as a number, but as a symbol, because speaking as someone who served in Japan from 2005 to 2008, and in 2008 returned to the State Department as the director of the Office of Japanese Affairs, I remember well significant strains in the bilateral relationships, some of which were driven by differences of approach over North Korea, the question of the state sponsor of terrorism list, Banco Delta Asia, and so on. It is not preordained that relations between the U.S. and Japan will be good or will be smooth. Moreover, early in the first term of President Obama, there was a transformational election in Japan, the emergence of a new DPJ-led government that also contained some early problematic approaches to issues of common concern, and yet the U.S. and Japan maintained equilibrium in the relationship, quickly righted the boat through the successive prime ministerships of Mr. Hatoyama, Mr. Khan, and Mr. Noda, and put things back on track. And now the relationship, I can attest, is very, very strong. That was evident, of course, in the U.S. response to the tsunami and Fukushima disaster back in 2011 under the Khan government. It's certainly evident in the significant progress that we've made on Okinawa and on the Defense Alliance and cooperation. We've resolved any number of bilateral irritants, like the ratification of the Hague Convention, which was a sore point. And we've developed a great record of global and regional cooperation, particularly in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific. We've made good progress on trade and economic and financial issues leading up to a breakthrough of sorts in Tokyo last week that I'm happy to talk about. The point, though, is that Japan matters hugely to us and to our strategic efforts in the region. And I want to build out a little bit about why Japan is so important. All of you know, without my telling you, that the starting point is the deep historic and cultural and people-to-people ties, the extent to which we share values, democratic values, human rights, market economy. And as a result, it is in our common interest to build out a region that is shaped by a culture of adherence to rules and norms. This is something that President Obama, during his visit to Asia over the last week, has consistently emphasized. We benefit, and as a major power, and Japan similarly as a large and influential power, we benefit from a system of rules, even though those rules conscribe our freedom of action. That's a trade-off that we are prepared to make because it serves the broader purpose of a stable region that allows for growth, that allows for continued peace, security, and non-confrontational resolution of issues that arise. In that context and beyond the region, the U.S. and Japan have flourished as diplomatic partners, in part because of these common interests. We work extremely closely in multilateral institutions across the board. We work closely on global development, and we work obviously to promote global and regional stability and prosperity. Outside of Asia, on the Middle East, Japan strongly supports the Middle East peace efforts and contributes generously to Palestinian economic growth and institution building. Syria is another example where Japan has provided a tremendous amount of aid to assist IDPs, to assist refugees, the countries that host them, and been very active in assisting in the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons stockpiles. Japan, of course, has been a leading donor of civilian assistance in Afghanistan, and that's going to continue. And on issues that emerge like the Ukraine, Japan has stepped forward to support the people of Ukraine, Ukraine's sovereignty, and working with others in the G7 has taken the difficult step to impose sanctions and to commit to impose further sanctions against Russia if the Russians continue to escalate there. Moving away from security, we have a very robust economic partnership, and Japan is a driver of regional economic growth, of global economic growth. We're the two largest free market economies in the world, with huge trade flows, huge two-way investments that generate hundreds and hundreds of thousands of jobs in the United States. We also, beyond the bilateral trade and financial relationship, cooperate, as I mentioned, on development aid, on disaster relief, on work in APEC and the G20 and G7, G8 to liberalize trade and investment rules to promote growth. And one piece of that is our collaboration on science and technology, which was a high point of the recent visit by President Obama to Japan, and is particularly significant in the 21st century because the two of us are actively sharing, actively collaborating and developing high-tech solutions to global problems. And lastly, as is all over the news, we continue to work on, and in fact, last week made significant progress on the issues, the bilateral issues relating to TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We identified, as the President and Mike Froman said, we identified a path forward Mike Froman described it as a breakthrough. I think one way of looking at it is that the U.S. and Japan now in the bilateral negotiations that are the critical next step regarding TPP really crossed an important threshold. It's not to say that all the issues are resolved, they're not, but to say that the negotiations now are focused on what we can get done and how we can get them done, not focused on the obstacles and the things that we can't do. Lastly, and most relevant to the conference, were security partners, and I'll leave it to Mark Lippert to speak on the alliance itself and on global security cooperation. But what I'd like to emphasize is, first, we mean it when we each describe our alliance as the cornerstone of regional security. It really is. Not only ensuring our mutual security, but also ensuring the stability and the prosperity of the region, as we have in the last half of the previous century and have every intention of continuing in the 21st century, which is why we are modernizing our alliance. I would point to the creation of the National Security Council in Japan as a significant step in the direction of greater internal and bilateral coordination. And I'd mention two issues that came up during the President's visit and that I know are of interest to all of you. The first relates to the Senkakus and the famous Article 5 of the Defense Treaty. A lot has been made and will be made, no doubt, of the President's statement while he was in Tokyo, but he went to some pains to explain this isn't a new article, this isn't a new treaty, this isn't a new policy. And you know, the facts are unchanged. The policy is unchanged. This is something that the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State have clearly affirmed. So, number one, it's true. I mean, Article 5 of the Mutual Defense Treaty does in fact stipulate that areas under Japan's administrative control, i.e. the Senkakus, are germane to the treaty. And secondly, we're well on record as saying that, so for the President to articulate it simply serves to reassure. It also serves to remove any lingering doubt that there might be of our position as well as our resolve. So it made sense for the President on the occasion of his state visit to make clear our position. At the same time, as he signaled, it's incumbent on all of us to remember that the purpose of the alliance, the purpose of the treaty, is to maintain the peace. And nothing in what the President said or did is meant as or should be construed as a provocative posture towards China. Second is the issue regarding collective self-defense. And again, I'll leave it to my colleague, Mark, to speak to that in defense and military terms. But this, of course, is a very sophisticated audience. But outside this room, there are in some quarters a tendency to offer a bit of a caricature of collective self-defense as somehow a step on the path of remilitarization in Japan or abolishing Article 9 of the Constitution and so on. I think that it's very important to recognize collective self-defense, this issue, as being about Japan's effort and ability to play a more proactive role in contributing to regional peace and stability and its own defense. The starting point is that the principle of collective self-defense is enshrined in the UN Charter, and certainly our view is it's right and proper for the Japanese government and the Japanese people to consider whether they choose to exercise that right. It's also important to remember that in any event, whether it's collective self-defense or other aspects of Japan's defense modernization, it's all occurring within the framework of the U.S.-Japan alliance. That's a critically important point. I'm running long, I know. Let me just touch on four sets of issues that we are dealing with in the context of the U.S.-Japan alliance. One is how to manage differences with China, how to influence China's rise, a rise that we welcome, but that we seek to ensure occurs in a manner that contributes to the stability and the prosperity and the security of the region. How do we encourage the kind of constructive behavior from China that we all want to see in the international system? The U.S.-Japan solidarity and our alliance, as President Obama reinforced in his visit to Tokyo and elsewhere in Asia last week, is not anti-China. At the same time, the United States is determined not to accede to any kind of push to marginalize Japan or to vilify Japan. We benefit from a region in which Japan is a strong, influential, and economically thriving partner, and we think that that is an important ingredient for the Asia-Pacific region in the 21st century, along with the rise of China. A second issue of concern and focus is the Japan-Korea relationship and the need to manage tensions, manage history in a way that looks forward as well as backwards. Both are democracies, both are free markets, both are very close allies, and we have worked and continue to work to encourage both Japan and Korea to take the steps, to reciprocate to those steps, to be responsive, to be restrained, to demonstrate the prudence and the patience needed to address these sensitive historical issues and to improve ties. Thirdly is Southeast Asia, where we're working on multilateral architecture and capacity building. And the last, as I've mentioned, is the economic agenda, not only the so-called third arrow, but TPP, energy development, and the support for structural reforms in Japan that can expand and help revitalize Japan. So I've been long. Let me stop there and turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you very much. We will come back to some of those issues in our conversation, but first Mark Lippert is going to share with us his thoughts on the Secretary Hagel's trip to Asia and the U.S.-Japan cooperation agenda. Mark, thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Admiral Blair. In the intro, it was mentioned that I was one of Senator Obama's earliest advisors. Or President Obama's earliest advisors working with him in the Senate. I would say, just let me add an amendment to that. Probably his earliest advisor on East Asia was Admiral Blair, and I know he remembers this conversation he had well in the Senate dining room. I'm probably embarrassing him a bit, but the Admiral was very kind in sharing his expertise, his deep knowledge. It ultimately led to this thing called the DNI position, and we're lucky to have him here today in his current role. So, Admiral, thanks for all you've done for our country. Thanks for inviting me here today. We really appreciate all of your expertise. Danny laid it out well, laid out the context. I've just done some sort of off-the-cuff notes to try to key off of what he said, and it's much more narrow on the security side. And what I thought I would do is try to use Secretary Hagel's trip to sort of juxtapose or have as a lens into some of these issues that Danny raised and drill down a little bit more on the security side. Let me just say at the outset too, look, this is a very exciting time to be working on security issues in the Alliance. It's very exciting. There's a lot of dynamic, energetic work from the action officer level all the way up to the leader level. And you know, it's been a great 2 or 3 years. A lot of this was started under the leadership of Chip Gregson, who I see in the audience, over at DOD, and it continues forth today. Just to sort of tick off some of the highlights over the last couple of years, you know, we've had our 2+2 in Tokyo, unprecedented, the announcement of the new TIPI-2 radar site, the environmental impact statement down in Okinawa, the Okinawa Consolidation Plan, all leading up to the landfill permit on the FRF to allow that to move forward. Then, of course, we've got the guidelines review, collective self-defense, and a lot of capabilities that the U.S. is bringing to the alliance, as are the Japanese. On the Japanese side, of course, Danny touched on the National Security Council, there's the secrets law, there's the new arms export control policy, and then there's new innovative things the Japanese Self-Defense Force is doing in and around the region, in Southeast Asia and beyond. So again, very dynamic, very exciting, very, very opportunistic time to be working on security issues in the alliance. You know, I've also been fortunate to work for 2 Secretary of Defenses who've really embraced and been part of the catalyst for this momentum, Secretary Panetta and now Secretary Hagel. And Secretary Hagel, you know, has been lucky enough to work with a great counterpart in Defense Minister Onodera. Secretary Panetta was very fortunate to work with Defense Minister Morimoto, who's here, who's responsible for a lot of the good progress we're benefiting from today. So with that, I thought I'd just turn to the Secretary's trip and kind of walk through a couple of the issues that he discussed in Japan and a little bit about their impact in the region. You know, this was his 4th trip to Asia in just about a year. He also stopped in China and Mongolia and then hosted the first ever U.S. ASEAN Defense Ministers Forum in Hawaii before he got to Japan. This was his 4th meeting with Defense Minister Onodera. The visit also included meetings with Foreign Minister Kishida, and of course, the Prime Minister was gracious enough to spend a little time with the Secretary. You know, I think the other thing that I would highlight just in terms of pure meetings, the Secretary has spent a lot of time on the alliance, and he is not, I would say, he's worked to make sure that he reaches across the Japanese government, and he's also met with the new National Security Advisor here in Washington. He's going to meet this week with the LDP party chair, Mr. Ishiba, and of course he's been on the phone a couple of times with the Chief Cabinet Secretary as well. So, you know, he's looking at this as a broad, comprehensive relationship that's not just about security, but is about, you know, a whole of government approach dealing with the security aspects. On the trip itself, really we covered five key issues. There were other issues that we covered, happy to get into that more, but just the 5 highlights in Japan. And look, this audience, as Danny said, is an experienced one, so these will be familiar issues, but just to give folks a status update on where we stand after the Secretary's trip, I thought would be appropriate here today. First, North Korea. I think the bottom line here is that we share the assessment. It's an extremely dangerous situation, and both the minister and the Secretary, in their capacities, took steps on this recent visit to try to move forward a better defense architecture. We recommitted to trying to get the TIPI-2 radar up and running by the second site up and running by the end of the year. That's an aggressive timeline. Both sides have truncated, I think, sort of the usual bureaucratic processes to try to get this done because it's so important. And then, of course, the Secretary also announced 2 new additional ballistic missile defense surface combatants that will arrive in Japan by 2017. That will bring the total number of surface combatants with that capability to 7 by 2017. You know, there was a discussion, you know, this is not done in a vacuum on North Korea. Obviously, the sanctions track, the UN track was very important. We touched on that issue, but, you know, we focused on the security side. And then, obviously, on a little bit beyond just the bilateral piece, we had an in-depth discussion on the trilateral piece with the Republic of Korea, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But you know, the most operative form, obviously, is trilateral cooperation on missile defense, dealing with the North Korea threat, and we had a good discussion there. You know, the takeaway is that we are very much on a united front here with the Japanese in terms of that we want, you know, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and there was really no daylight between the minister and the secretary. The second issue that dovetails off the first was a good discussion on trilateral security cooperation with the Republic of Korea. You know, we've seen some pretty good momentum with the Leaders Summit in The Hague. We had the defense trilateral talks sort of approaching in the window, and we wanted to kind of do a touch with the defense minister to make sure that things were on track, that we kind of continued the momentum that we had especially on the security cooperation front with respect to the trilateral fora. The DTTs here that we held in Washington were very productive. They were very substantive. There was a lot of good crosstalk between all three parties. We had a very good statement come out of it in the end, and I think we're looking forward for even more progress heading into Shangri-La, where we traditionally do a trilateral meeting at the minister level. So we felt like the bilateral stop in Japan helped us move forward a little bit on this issue, and I think everybody underscores the importance there. You know, and I'd also say just, you know, out of the DTTs and some of the conversations with both the Koreans and the Japanese, look, we're now, you know, moving the trilateral sort of cooperation out of the area. In fact, you know, we did a counter-piracy trilateral exercise in the CENTCOM AOR at the end of the year, so there's a lot of good sort of operational and policy work to be done there. The third issue was we touched upon maritime disputes, and Danny really covered the landscape there. I don't have a lot to add to that, other than I would just underscore that the Secretary of Defense's messages, both in public and in private, were consistent, if not exactly the same, in Tokyo and in Beijing. He delivered the same message he did to Defense Minister Onodera than he did to the Defense Minister in China, as well as other counterparts that he visited along the way. So, you know, Danny articulated the policy. The Secretary made the point about Article 5, but he also, as Danny mentioned, did, you know, take a moment to emphasize that, you know, look, at the end of the day, we are very much supportive of a peaceful resolution to this situation. The treaty is there as a deterrent measure, and it's there to promote peace and security, and that's the business that the Defense Department is in, and the security side especially. But ultimately, you know, these are two great countries with two strong frontline foreign ministries that are capable of working out a diplomatic solution, and that was something that the Secretary emphasized as well. The fourth issue quickly was continued progress on posture. I touched on it a little bit at the outset, but look, the big muscle movement that everybody tracks is Futenma and Guam. On Futenma, you know, the Secretary expressed a deep appreciation to the Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet for the landfill permit and the efforts of the governor there. That was you know, we view that as an important step. A lot of work left to be done. I think, you know, the next phase is sort of a engineering planning phase that a guy with a political science background cannot understand, but that's moving forward. And we are looking at ways of trying to expedite. You know, we have a very good Okinawa consolidation plan in place, but at the same time, if there are ways we can go faster and work creatively together to go faster, we are very much open to that on the U.S. side, and I know the government of Japan is as well. On the piece of Guam, you know, we continue to make some pretty good progress as well. You know, the Congress was gracious enough to give us a couple of exemptions for certain projects, two big projects There are other projects, but two big ones going forward on Upper Harbor and the North Ramp at Anderson. And those continue. The Japanese side has shown more flexibility on how to spend their money on Guam, and we continue at DoD to make progress on the certifications that the Congress has outlined to us in law that we have to make. And we've, the PACOM commander has made a certification over the last couple of years, the Commandant of the Marine Corps. We've done the independent study that was required by Congress. So we continue to both make progress on the certifications and then try to get these individual projects moving on the island so this can all come together in one piece. I would just say that, both sides, you can feel the energy and commitment to this. As I said, the things that used to take, a lot of time are moving faster. At the action officer level, there's just better cooperation and coordination, from the technical all the way up to the political level. You kind of would think some of the real milestone I would put on that, or example, was the Okinawa Consolidation Plan. That was just a great product, a very good cooperation level, both uniform, civilian, all the way from political to technical folks. So that to me encapsulated a really good energy and of folks working in and around that issue. Like I said, that was the big muscle movement on posture, but obviously the U.S. is bringing a lot of capabilities to the alliance. Really, some of our best assets are being put forward in Japan, and just to tick through a quick list, the P-8s, the new BMD platforms, the Global Hawk rotations, the F-35s by 2017, I believe, and then of course the Ospreys are all there. Those are high-end, high capability, high performing platforms, and we are very proud to work with Japanese friends to bring those to the alliance. The Japanese are reciprocating, putting forward, bringing some of their best capabilities as well, and also working with us on basing and access and all of that, all the things that go with that are very important. So, I think there's good progress there. Fifth, and last is collective self-defense and the guidelines review. Obviously, that was a topic of discussion. And look, people here know that the guidelines revision, the last time we did this was 1997. And I think bottom line here is three things have really changed. The security environment has changed, Japan has changed, and the alliance has changed. And you really have seen that from some of the cooperation we're doing in Iraq, that we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, some of the things that the Japanese did in the Philippines to respond to the recent natural disaster there. New areas, space, cyber, peacekeeping. And then, the 97 guidelines review also talked a lot about sort of a forward area and a rear area, and the U.S. was going to be in the front, and the Japanese would sort of do the support. Look, that's not the environment we're in these days, right? It's kind of a 360-degree environment in most of the situations we find ourselves in. So I think for all those reasons, we agreed with the proposal brought forward to us first informally by former Defense Minister Morimoto here, and he was a key driver of this, and I think we wholeheartedly agreed with his thinking, his rationale, and wanted to energize this process. We've had a very strong, very good dialogue both on the policy and the operational side, and our goal, a stated goal, is to wrap this up by the end of the calendar year. I think we are on pace to do that. Having said that, I think from the U.S. side, especially, we really want to get this right. I think that the deadline has been helpful in moving things along, but I think deliberate speed is sort of the watchword of the day. And I think look, I do think you do this so infrequently that it is really important to get this right. On collective self-defense, obviously this is a unilateral decision that the Japanese government has to make in consultation with its people, as Danny said, within the framework of the alliance, obviously. But Secretary Hagel voiced his support for this. This goes sort of hand in glove with the guidelines review. Obviously, if there is a change on collective self-defense, we could fold that into the guidelines review, and I think that would be sort of the a very good solution. But again, this is a decision for the Japanese government to make. I think what we have said on the U.S. side is just we've underscored the importance of transparency in this, transparency and consultation. That doesn't just apply to this issue, it applies to a whole host of issues on security in Northeast Asia and beyond. And our belief is you can do both. You can have good consultations, good transparency, listen to neighbors, to friends, to partners, but also bring more flexibility and military capabilities to the alliance. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, and that's something we're working hard to do. In closing, I would just say all of this, as Danny mentioned, sort of, foreshadows, or actually not foreshadows, but, it helps move Japan and the U.S. into a more regional role and out-of-area role. We've seen this in our discussions of the defense trilateral talks. We're now talking about areas that I never thought we would, just a few short years ago. You've seen trilaterals between, us and the Australians, us and the Indians. It's been a very sort of, you can kind of feel, the bilateral piece turning into sort of a more almost extra-regional and multilateral piece as we go along. So I think we're strongly supportive of that here at DoD. We think it's a huge help and a great partnership, and folds nicely into the core functions of the alliance. Finally, just to say, all of this is really part and parcel of the rebalance strategy. As Japan, has said, it is a linchpin of the rebalance strategy. And really what we're trying to do, working with the Japanese in the context of the alliance, is continue that security baseline, that security umbrella that we've worked with allies, partners, friends in the region to maintain an environment over the past several decades that has helped lead to unprecedented economic, political, and cultural growth. And we want to keep that momentum going. It's in our partners and allies' interest, but more and more it's in our interest. So we view this as a both-and equation, and we want to keep this going. So with that, I will stop there and turn it over to Sheila for any questions. Thanks.
Welcome back. Thanks. You both of you have outlined the very rich and full agendas that we have across the board with Japan, and I think you've done it very well. If we take a step back, clearly the Asia Pacific is confronting a pretty tremendous moment of geostrategic change. And it's not all about China, right? It is about a broader accommodation of this new rising power as well. And you both have pointed that out in your remarks. You know that there's anxiety, right? There's anxiety in the region about this geostrategic shift. There's anxiety here in Washington, right, about our ability to keep pace with the events in the region and this larger challenge. So to what extent are you confident that we can keep pace? And to what extent what do you see that we need to do now to look out 5, 10 years so that we're ready down the line when China is a bigger power? Perhaps a more integrated power, but perhaps we don't know yet. So if you could give us a short term, how do we keep pace with all of this change effectively, and what do we do for our longer term staying power in Asia? Danny, can we start with you?
Sure. Look, anxiety is part of human nature, and anxiety is always going to be an element of the way that the U.S. is viewed. It's either too much or too little in the eyes of many people, and you have to accept that without dismissing it. I think ultimately the most persuasive evidence of U.S. sustainability, credibility, is our economic recovery. And the ability of the United States to create a framework through TPP, which we are doing, that is comprehensive and high standards, that creates continuity and predictability in terms of economic growth, is a critical component to the other contribution that we're making on the security side, which is to maintain and sustain regional stability. That's very important. Now, these, as I said at the outset, the longer-term strategy isn't driven by crises, but it is tested by crises. And it's a strategy that starts with friends and allies, that seeks to develop regional institutions and regional architecture, not because it's in an international relations boutique project, but because we believe that there is a kind of culture of of rules and a role for peer pressure that is important. It's also an opportunity to create a forum in which all the countries in the region, including the emerging powers, including India, including Indonesia, but of course particularly China, have an opportunity to interact, have an opportunity to test and develop and amend these rules, both formal and informal rules. There's clearly a demand for U.S. engagement. That's part of what keeps us there, and I think keeps us credible. And we've met that demand, and in terms of the long term, I'm pretty confident we'll continue to meet that demand in the form of, say, annual meetings between the President of the United States and the 10 leaders of ASEAN, active participation in the East Asia Summit, in APEC, and so on. And the whole range of security and economic and political, cultural engagements, simply because they are driven not by theory, but by conviction that the U.S. interests, short-term and long-term, economic and security, rest in an active engagement and a leadership role for the United States in the Asia-Pacific region.
Thank you, Danny. Mark, if we look out, and I think over at DoD, you've got the task of making sure our alliances are effective, that our defense commitments are, that we have the readiness for our defense commitments should that occur. But there's also this longer term process of a military-to-military engagement with China to try also to build the institutional engagement on the security side in the Asia-Pacific. Do you feel we're keeping pace? What do you think we need to do to make sure that 5 to 10 years from now we're in good shape?
Thanks for the question. Look, I do think we are keeping pace. I think our track record, I'll just speak on the DoD side, is pretty strong so far. I mean, you look at Australia, Singapore, the recent agreement in the Philippines, what I just talked about with Japan, the new SMA agreement in Korea. Sorry, I'm using an acronym here, but it's DoD speak. Updating our policy on New Zealand. A New Zealand ship now can visit military ports on a waiverable basis. And then, the unprecedented meeting in Hawaii with the 10 ASEAN defense ministers. So, look, I think we have kept pace and are keeping pace and are probably, a step ahead at this point. Obviously, the other side, what looms large is, for us, is a return to sequestration. And that does loom large. I think we've managed our way through it, a couple of tough years, a lot of downward pressure on the top line, a little bit of a reprieve, in 14 and 15. But, if we return to sequestration, I think it will cause a lot of instability and problems within the department. On the longer term picture, it's DoD is by nature a planning organization, and I think part and parcel of that in terms of an example is the guidelines review, right? We could probably keep doing what we're doing, for a little while longer, but I think thanks to the vision of Defense Minister Morimoto, Secretary Panetta, Secretary Hagel, and now Defense Minister Onodera, is that we're getting ahead of it, right? We're updating the alliance for the next couple of decades to deal with these, and there are other examples of this within the department and with our allies. Final point, just on the China mill-to-mill piece that you alluded to. Look, I think we are working to deepen and broaden that every day. We have new unprecedented areas of cooperation. The Chinese in RIMPAC is, I think, a watershed. The dialogue with Secretary Panetta was, it was frank, but it was real. There was a real back and forth, and we were sort of moving towards a real dialogue with the Chinese, and we are deeply appreciative of them allowing us to see the carrier, which again was I think for us, we interpreted it of a symbol of us, raising the issue of transparency and consultation with them. So again, I think it is a both-and equation, and we are trying to do both at the Department of Defense.
I have 3 more questions, but I'd really like to give the audience an opportunity because they rarely get that opportunity. Let me see. There's only the gentleman in the back. I can't see you from here. So please identify yourself and be very, very brief, please.
John Zhang with CTI TV of Taiwan. Secretary Russell, you were saying that what the president said in Japan on the Diaoyutai Senkaku issue were not anti-China. Would you think that your Chinese colleagues in Beijing agree with you? Are you concerned in any way that this may further alienate or even antagonize the Chinese, pushing them on a strategic scale to, for instance, Russia? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't mean to cut you off. There are sensitivities in the region, clearly, and we have these challenges now between allies as well as between the others in the region. What do you see our role, Danny, in trying to smooth the way, if we can, smooth the way between Japan-China or Japan-South Korea, and in the context not only of the island disputes, but other tensions as well?
Well, I think our role is to provide a credible and dependable framework that helps maintain security and that marks off bounds, coercive or threatening behavior. As Mark pointed out, there's no good reason why the political and security-related differences among the countries in the Asia-Pacific region can't be managed or over time can't be resolved through diplomatic means. Now, we've made clear that ultimately recourse to international legal mechanisms is a legitimate form of addressing some of the problems, as witnessed the case of the Philippines and their ITLOS filing. But to the gentleman's question, and without presuming to speak for the government of China, we have a very open, direct, robust, and multi-layered set of communication links with the Chinese that allow us in a structured as well as in an informal way to explain what we're doing and why, what we're concerned about, what we're asking for towards China. I think that the Chinese have all the tools they need to understand that what the United States is signaling is not inimical to China's interests. This is not an effort in any means to contain China, but that we are adamant in the view that the territorial disputes and other differences between China and its neighbors need to be resolved in a peaceful way, in a diplomatic way. We are also pretty forthcoming with our advice from one big country to another, as the President has made clear, that it's essential that big countries like the United States, like China, tread carefully, resist the temptation to throw our weights around, manifest respect for not only international law, but the conventions and the norms in the region. We see this as a recipe for China's growth, for China's good relations with its neighbors, and for a region that thrives.
Thank you, Danny. Mark, you've had some challenges along the way in terms of the conversation with Beijing, for example, on how to manage relations with its neighbors. Risk reduction has become a pretty broad theme for our thinking about how to talk with China. And you've also had to manage the ADIZ announcement. Can you share with us your sense of how much progress you sense in terms of persuading China that its interests are really better served through a more collaborative conversation on military and strategic issues with its neighbors and with us?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Sheila, that, you know, it's, we have a very clear-eyed view on our relationship with Beijing. I think, you know, we know that they're going to be, it's going to kind of move forward, you know, in I would say fits and starts, for lack of a better word. There's going to be progress, there's going to be difficulties, but I think that comes with the territory with two big countries often. So Look, I think on the positive side of the ledger, I think we are seeing deeper, broader, more mill-to-mill cooperation, than we have previously. And I think, the dialogue is, as I mentioned, is getting better, and it's getting more real, less scripted, and we are sort of seeing tangible outcomes of these conversations. So I think that's on the positive side of the ledger. On the other side, look, we've got a long ways to go. I mean, it's a very small channel. It's not as big, broad, and robust as we'd like it to be. I think both sides, still need to sort of work in terms of trying to find more informal opportunities as well as the formal dialogue. So I think that's kind of where we are on that piece of the mill-to-mill equation.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both for spending some time with us this morning. I know how pressing your schedule is, and I promised I'd get you out. So would you join me in thanking Danny Russell and Mark Lippert? Thank you very much.